So I now throw open the floor to the questioning to the floor. May I request you to keep your questions short because we are slightly short of time, and maybe take 3 questions at a time. And when you ask the question, please identify yourself. Okay, I see one hand there, please.
Hello.
So address your question to either one speaker or more. Yeah.
Okay. My name is John Vaughter. I'm a research associate at ISAS. I'm very fascinated in the interplay between the traditional media system and what's happening in social media right now. To provide some context about how I'm thinking about this question, I'm from the United States. I'm from Oklahoma, which is a very Republican state. And in this state, I noticed there were kind of a schism in 2 different types of public spheres long before social media kind of came into play. You know, you have the Fox News Network and you also have MSNBC. What's interesting is that later, once Facebook came onto the scene, I saw that lots of people who are already very divided in their ideologies started to use social media as a way to kind of have battles with one another. And I would assume that for fake news, that becomes a way that you can kind of post a point that would either generate support within your own network or you can argue with somebody else. In the context of India, it seems like many people are skeptical about business or political affiliations with different big media organizations. And if there's a distrust in the media, that perhaps leads one to use social media for other ends. What is the connection between the privatized media system within India, trust in that media system, the different types of public spheres that creates, and then the way that social media is being used, is I suppose my question.
Did Govind, you want to respond?
I think the quick answer to that is belief in mainstream media is low and perhaps at the lowest ever. And it doesn't help that in many cases, you know, I've been part of mainstream media and now obviously I'm not. But in many cases of fake news, for instance, that we've seen, mainstream media has also been a culprit for various reasons. I mean, it could be because of wanting to catch something first, or just maybe trying to build viewership on television or viewership on web pages and so on. So it doesn't help. So, but I think there is a larger trust deficit, and all of this in some ways rides on that trust deficit.
Okay, Nalin.
Very quick, I'm not sure if I have the right answer to your question, but a couple of observations which may spark a chain of thought. The first is that something significant has changed on Google Trends in the last 6 months, which is this, that 6 months ago, if something like a Pulwama air attack would happen, you would find, or 8 months ago, you would find most Google Trends searches would be on that event. When Pulwama actually happened, something had shifted. People were searching for Aaj Tak Live. And this is responding to a question on trust in mainstream media. Because yes, you know, this goes back to a larger question of, you know, what is fake news? It's like if you go by the Trumpian definition, then whatever you don't agree with is fake news. Whatever doesn't agree with your worldview. So I think in India, in the last 6 months, we've seen a change where, of course, different media organizations are aligned to different ideological viewpoints. There are some which are centrist. The Times of India, for example, is fairly centrist. There are others which are much more right-wing. There are others which are much more left-wing. But earlier on YouTube, for this is much more specific for YouTube, but people were searching for information on a particular topic. Now they're searching for a media organization, and not just what the media organization is saying, they're searching for what it is saying live. They're saying Aaj Tak Live. Aaj Tak is a television channel in India, or Times Now Live. They want to see, because they make that distinction now between what their organization reported 10 minutes ago or what it's saying now. So there's a shift in consumption pattern happening. Second is on something on fake news. We also run a fact-checking desk, and we do it in 8 different languages. And we have seen a trend on consumption on fake news busting, which is this, that for some reason, every time we put out a fake news busting story, we find that the consumption of that story is not, and we promote it very significantly on all our platforms, is typically less than what we would expect. And this is not because people are dumbed down or which would be the easy answer to give, that, well, people are just interested in what they like, and if this doesn't agree with their worldview, they don't like it, they don't read it. Actually, Contrary to that, every time we put up something which is contrarian in terms of news or analysis, or which gives a new perspective to something, our readership goes up significantly. But that doesn't apply to a fake news busting story. And we're not quite sure what to make of that. Part of that reason may well be that there have been two recent pieces of research. One, and Govind would know more about this. In the US, there have been two studies that came out last year that a lot of fake news was being consumed or being believed more by those who were pre-teenagers, the first-time adopters of the media, or those who are actually older than 60, who are also coming onto the medium now. And being believed less by those in the those in the middle of those age groups. For the first time, we had a research in India on this, which was published about 3 months back by the MAI, and the conclusions of that study, which is not conclusive, also pointed to a similar trend, that it's the early 20s are far more skeptical of what they see as fake news, because they're more they like whereas compared to the early teenagers. And the early teenage attitude may be similar to those in their late 60s who are just adopting WhatsApp now. Those are very early tentative things which may make us rethink our assumptions on how this is being consumed.
Yeah.
So I'll make a very quick point on this, is that your question about individuals looking at media institutions versus, traditional media or established media versus other sources, one important distinction is that you have to think about media as individuals themselves, i.e. journalists, and what they are. And one important thing that has changed in the last decade, and Nalin and Govind might be able to directly address this, is that journalists are required to have their own following, and in many organizations their bonus might be tied to how many people follow you on social media. So you might actually distrust a certain news organization, but the individual who represents that news organization, i.e. the journalist, might have their own locuses of trust and distrust, which operate entirely differently from how that channel itself works, which is really important in a place like India, where news organizations don't openly say that we lean towards this or that. So there is a veneer of neutrality on the face of it, and then added to that, you have to look at what is the individual as the channel as it matters to them.
A very quick point. I think everyone is right, but the bigger point that there is trust deficit in mainstream media is also a constructed narrative. So we have to really take it with a kind of grain of salt, because we do not know if there is severe trust deficit around mainstream media. But what is interesting is the culture of trust that has developed around WhatsApp messaging. I think that is very important. And the instantaneity of reception of messages and circulation, sometimes you do not even question or relate with that message in terms of trust or not trusting, but prior identities. And I'll give you a concrete example to demonstrate this. I was looking at the Azad Maidan riot in Mumbai city and how morphed images, something you mentioned, morphed images were getting circulated, right? And this was about how violence in Myanmar, where the Rohingya Muslims were being targeted by the Buddhist monks. And these messages were circulating in Mumbai city, and there was a huge rally organized to protest this. And when I was watching how this message was getting circulated, I noticed that it reached almost every Muslim household and not many other families. So that tells us that the sociological point that media is getting consumed and trust is being accorded to it via the identities and social groups that people already belong to. I think that is something that we need to take into account.
Thank you, Shana. We have 10 minutes or so for more questions. Rani?
I was wondering... Thank you. It was a fascinating panel. I don't know much about the subject, so I think many of us are still trying to absorb all of this wonderful information you gave us. I'm wondering, most of you have had backgrounds in different countries. And so when you think about fake media and the use of digital media and comparative perspective, for example, Trump's use of digital media and comparing that with how Modi used digital media, what do you, for me, looking at how Modi has used social media, sort of, India is now in many ways at the forefront of using, or the BJP at least, was using digital media to get out the vote, to get people mobilized at the grassroots levels. And I'm wondering if, based on your different experiences, you have insights into how you would look at the use of digital media for political purposes in India. How? Please, thanks.
Does, yeah, yeah, there are some more questions. Actually, I don't see any hands, so while you sort of cogitate, Joyojeet and then Nalin.
Yeah, so we did look at Trump, Narendra Modi, Geert Wilders, and Nigel Farage, and their use of certain kinds of discourse in the run-up to the elections and how people reacted to that. And as leaders, by and large, they will not use fake news per se, but things which is why Govind's point is really important, which is that we shouldn't be thinking of fake news, but things which are, gently disinformation or moving you to a certain direction rather than explicitly fake, because that you can pinpoint as fake. What we found is that as long as what is being said aligns with the persona of the politician online, that is what matters in the consumption rather than it being true or not. So it's like your mental image of what that leader stands for is important in whether you buy into it rather than the veracity of it. And actually, also in response to another point which was made before, is that there are studies which show that people will repropagate stories that they know or suspect to not be true so long as it aligns with their worldview. So.
Yeah, that was a very good question, Rani. And my immediate response on that is there's a huge difference, just to take Trump and Modi in the way they use Twitter. To illustrate this, it's like, I was recently speaking to a BJP senior minister, and he said, we were having exactly this discussion, and he said, I'll say it in Hindi, "Arey wo Trump na, wo to toilet seat se baith ke tweet karta hai." That he tweets from his toilet seat. The point being that for Trump, there's no comparison in the way Modi and Trump tweet, because Trump uses it, he has always used it as a way to bypass all other formal channels of communication. It's far more instinctive. It's far more, whatever catches his fancy, he puts it out there. Whereas in Modi's case, Modi has always been extremely disciplined and extremely conscious about his message from day one. And it's not just how he uses the media, it's about how he's made the entire party and the government use social media as well, which is completely distinct structurally from how Trump uses it. Trump uses it as an outlier in the system. There's a huge difference in how the White House operates on social media and how the PMO in India operates and other ministries operate structurally. To illustrate this, about 2 or 3 years ago, Modi mandated that all ministers must have social media accounts. Not just their information officers, the ministers themselves, and they must, it's systemic down to the level to propagate what they are saying. And they decide every day, each ministry had a social media strategy, which wasn't just, if you do it, if you like it, do it. It was very structural, exactly as a mirror image of what the PMO was doing. So if you see Modi's messaging, it's very, I don't think you can point out any tweet from Modi in the last 5 years, whether you agree with him or not ideologically, where you would say, oh, this is offline from their messaging, both as Prime Minister or as leader of the BJP. Whereas for Trump, almost every tweet, you would say, oh, yeah, what the hell is he talking about? I mean, this guy's gone off off the kilter. So there's a huge difference. Modi uses it as a structural tool, and this is, by the way, ministers were told that they'll be rated on how they use the media as a strategic tool for informing the public, but also to respond to the public. This is down from the PMO down to every ministry. Now, there are some who do it better and some who do it worse. That's a huge, huge difference.
Okay,
A very quick point. When you talk about comparative kind of perspectives on digital politics, it's not just populist leaders, which is very important. I think Trump and Modi and all other political leaders, including Erdogan, for instance, the way they use online media and raise troll armies or through decent messaging is a very important point. But what we've also found in our comparative project on online extreme speech is that there are convergences between online users, ordinary online users. I was talking to an Alternative for Deutschland, the right-wing political party in Germany, and this volunteer, when I listened to the interview I took of him, it was strikingly similar to an internet Hindu in India. So that there are these circulating narratives, even the tropes are becoming very similar. So we have tried to see this as some sort of humoric and also a generic effects of digital media, where you are able to see and establish what they call as counterculture to serious mainstream narratives. And this idea about Lügenpresse in Germany, the lying press, or here, the fake news. See, all these are narratives that are also becoming common. So I think we should also get into what are ordinary people doing with digital politics, and there you see global convergences occurring.
One quick point.
Sure.
So on the US, the Washington Post tracks, among others, tracks Trump statements. They're now almost touching 10,000 lies. 10,000, okay? So when they first started pointing it out and people started noticing it, Donald Trump was averaging 4 lies a day. After it became a big issue, the number of lies went up to 6 per day. So that's something that cannot be matched even if someone tries by anyone else. I think it's really and India, I think, as Nalin has pointed out, the BJP is very, very sharp in its vision, as about its whole organization, in its vision, in its execution, in its delegation of effort, and that applies to social media as well. And I think that we've already talked about.
we have a couple of minutes, and your last chance to ask questions, very short. Okay, Archana, and then...
Hi, I'm Archana from ISAS. I have 2 questions to any one of the panelists.
Very brief.
I'm just wondering how much of a divide exists between narratives on social media and on ground when it comes to election campaigns. And my second question is, how do we measure the impact? We all know that BJP has used social media extensively, but how can we actually measure the impact and, for example, say that Modi has won elections or the BJP has won such a majority because of the election campaigns or not?
Okay, and the last question, Dinkin at the back. Yeah.
Hi, so my question is an extension of that and around correlation between spending on social media and electoral success. And so if I could frame it in a way that, a few years ago, this social media presence was seen as a level playing field enabler for new political actors for whom the cost of, say, advertising in traditional media was very high, like Aam Aadmi Party, for example. So what we're hearing today is, the teams that these political parties are employing, the machinery, these sound like a lot of money and resources. So what has changed there? Or what's the new frontier for new political players or movements like that if they were to, to repeat some of the Aam Aadmi Party type of...
Okay, we have time for very quick responses, so I'll just start from the left. Govind. Yeah.
What was the earlier question? I think that was more...
One was measuring the impact of social media and how it contributes to
Yeah.
or any party's victory. Whether is it measurable?
Yeah, so I think the loss is sometimes more measurable than the victory. So we know that someone didn't succeed in using social media. I mean, a very broad statement. I think if we look at how the social media universe has functioned in India in the run-up to the elections, I think it's quite clear that social media has played a role. But I will always, as a journalist who at least should be seen as objective, I will pause there, because even in the case of the 2016 US presidential elections, where it's very clear that, and there's more research on that, and that's one reason you can refer to it, that let's say misinformation, using technology, using selective targeting played a role. It's next to impossible to say and with a firmly in a democracy that people were fooled into voting for someone. Because at the end of the day, you did have a choice. And perhaps you believed something that was served into your WhatsApp inbox, but you also had the choice of not believing it and therefore voting for someone else. So it's a very, very tricky area, and it requires a lot more research-based response rather than an intuitive one.
Nalin, very quick.
I would agree with Govind. You mentioned AAP. In the case of AAP, for example, when it won the Delhi election and as the third force and so on, I remember several analyses done of the AAP versus the BJP on Twitter and so on, and sentiment analyses show that AAP was winning many of those battles. AAP still continues to win some of those battles in Delhi, and it runs a very sophisticated IT cell, just like Congress and BJP still do. But I'm increasingly finding, this, Sahana raised the term, the Internet Hindu, that the online audience in India was traditionally always far more right-wing Hindu than what opinion polls showed otherwise for the larger audience. I think that what all the opinion poll data is showing, and post-poll data by classes is showing, is that gap has significantly shrunk in this election. I'll give you an example. We ran several online polls last year, and in every poll, if you run, and those were polls with people polling, and we were very particular about making sure people weren't gaming it, IT cells weren't gaming it by one guy will vote 10 times. So we put in a lot of filters to do that. And these were polls with sample sizes of about 500 to 600,000 each. And on the online polling, typically 70% of people would always vote for BJP. That if you ask them on most metrics, they would vote for BJP. And that was a huge difference from what the actual polling of more scientific polling using segments and so on, psephological polling was showing, which was nearly about 30-35% polling for BJP. That gap has shrunk significantly between what the online Internet Hindu is saying and what other scientific polling of the offline Hindu is saying. There's still a huge gap in that, but increasingly that gap has shrunk. And now, is that a perfect answer? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, that needs a lot more work, I think.
Okay. Sahana, any?
Very quickly, I think measuring impact is a very difficult process. And I would say that measuring impact should not be defined and confined by electoral outcomes alone. I think one of the key parameters would be how many hate crimes have happened in a country like India in the last 5 years. And are they linked to social media circulation? So sort of event-centric social media analysis would be very important. I think that would be one of the metrics. The second metric would be how many abuse reports have been registered across different police stations in India. So I would go for many other parameters, what we call social parameters, to understand impact rather than electoral success alone, although it's important.
Okay, the final word goes to Joyojeet.
Super. If you followed, say, the Chhattisgarh elections, right, the last cycle, and if you looked at social media as an indicator of what was happening in Chhattisgarh, you would think Raman Singh would win this hands down, right? And this is a great reason for why you need to really balance out what's happening on social media with what kind of causal inferences can you draw. And you can draw certain kinds of inferences. One of the things which hasn't been done and which I think you can do is look at second order effect as a causal inference. So what is being said on social media, and does that show up on what's happening in the news? And there are ways of studying that. But the actual election outcome, much, much harder, and I don't even think there's a real point. You can say things like, is the level of social media engagement relative to whether people are likely to vote and are middle class and things like that, but not really like, is this person winning or not? The last point I'll make is that there is this real Arab Spring leftover, which relates to your question, which is this myth that people have bought into, that the people are going to rise and use social media to throw over institutions. And that thing is dead, as in, institutions can capture social media in really strong ways, and that is something we need to think about, even if you think simply about who can you effectively troll, who can you legally pull down. And there are so many cases in India for people who have been pulled down or harassed, arrested for things that they said on social media, while the same thing said by a politician they would get away from, because there is a state which stands behind, there is institutions which stand behind the ways that the individual versus powers equation works out, and that same thing just gets replicated on social media.
Okay. Thank you. On that note, I'll hand the floor over to Vani.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sen, and to all the panelists. That was really interesting. I would now like to invite Mr. Christian Echle, Director of Regional Program Dialogue Asia, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, to give the closing remarks. Mr. Echle, please.
Thank you. Okay. I was just opening my Facebook app and I was typing in, I'm attending a very boring discussion about the Indian elections and social, and my app shut down. This is how effective false news are here in Singapore banned. So the app won't even allow me to say that this was a boring discussion because it would be false news. It was a very exciting discussion, and I would like to thank you for the insights that you shared about the Indian elections and the role of the social media. I think it's definitely fair to say that it was not the decisive element for the outcome of the elections, but it surely changed the political culture in India in a way that we haven't seen before. And I think the dimensions that you raised just now are very relevant and also very important to look deeper into. I would just like to mention 4 points that you made. Professor Udupa, you mentioned that there might be a structural advantage for right-wing parties, populist parties, in using these tools. I find this a highly interesting statement, and I think this is something that could be looked deeper into, whether parties on the left side, progressive parties, could maybe still not use similar systems or similar psychology to reach out to their voters. I would really like to emphasize the point that Govind made on the question of media literacy. I think this is a huge challenge. Huge is probably not even a big enough word to use, especially when it comes to a population of closer to 1 billion people. How to reach all of them, how to convince that it's necessary to look behind the news, behind the pictures, and to get a better understanding of this. So thank you very much for pointing this out. I was very impressed by Nalin's discussion of the funds and the organization that went into the fairly masterful way of BJP using social media from a political campaigning perspective. This was surely the most exciting point, and it will be interesting to see whether other parties around the world will be able to do it in a similar way. And lastly, Joyojeet, the point that it's not only about the election result, but how this all affects our political culture. I think this is at the core of what we have to look at, and this is also what is probably most relevant for Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. We care deeply about questions of political culture, and I think right now we are living in a time where we sometimes don't see what hits us. It changes so fast, the political culture, and this is a really, really big challenge, and I think we can really learn a lot by looking at what happened in India. So thank you again very much for sharing all your insights today. I really have to emphasize, since I'm representing a German foundation, I have to just add one quick story from Germany to show how much behind we are in comparing to what you just described. We are really on the learning side of this. Just before the European elections, there was a YouTube video coming up in Germany. It was called The Destruction of CDU. CDU happens to be the governing party and the party that what now? What should we do? How should we respond? Are they actually going to drop bombs on the CDU headquarters, or what do they mean by destruction? It turned out that destruction is a YouTube slang for a fairly critical, fairly critical look into CDU's policies. But CDU headquarters really didn't know how to respond. It turned out to be a huge challenge for them. The video had 5 million views within 2 or 3 days. And even after the election, our chairwoman said, well, we have to look into some kind of rules for sharing public opinions just before the elections on social media and YouTube. And immediately was in a discussion about curtailing the freedom of expression. So I think we are really at the start of this in Germany to understand the impact on political culture through social media. And this is why it's so important for us to learn from other countries and India in particular. I would like to close today's event by thanking the panelists one more time, our wonderful chairman, of course, for keeping the time and keeping the discussion engaged. I would like to thank our wonderful partners from ISIS, Raja Mohan. It's always a pleasure to work with your team, and I'm looking forward to the next events. I'm always looking forward to elections. Elections are a sign of democracy, so that's a good thing. But the next event, actually tomorrow, we'll continue the discussion in a smaller room with a smaller group of people. But then there's also more events to come in the year, and I would already like to very much invite you to the future cooperation events of ISIS and Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. Lastly, I would like to thank the teams, both of Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and ISIS, for doing a wonderful job in preparing this event. And as I said, I'm already looking forward to the second part tomorrow. I ended in time because I understand that there's a cricket match between India and the West Indies. And even if soccer is slightly more important in Germany than cricket, I know that it was important to end on time today, to do this in the afternoon, not in the evening, because no one wants to get involved or wants to challenge an Indian cricket match, in particular if it's the World Cup match. So again, thank you very much for attending and enjoy the rest of the day.